Long before castles crowned the hills of Britain, the island was a patchwork of warring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each ruled by chieftains who called themselves kings but commanded little more than muddy villages and loyal spears. It was a world without borders as we would recognize them, where power was earned through the sword and lost just as quickly. Yet from this chaos rose men who dreamed of something larger, a unified England. Alfred the Great, ruler of Wessex, held back the Viking tide when all seemed lost, rallying his people from the marshes of Somerset when his kingdom had nearly collapsed entirely. His descendants would slowly stitch together the fractured kingdoms, laying the first threads of what would one day become a single English crown. But unity was fragile, and the old Viking blood still ran hot in the north. Danish kings would seize the throne, only for English blood to reclaim it, back and forth, in a rhythm of conquest that would define the island's identity for generations. Then, in the autumn of 1066, everything changed forever. Off the coast of Normandy, a duke named William watched the winds shift in his favor. He believed the English throne had been promised to him, and when Harold Godwinson was crowned king instead, William saw only usurpation. He gathered his knights, his mercenaries, and his ambition, and sailed across the Channel to claim what he believed was rightfully his. At Hastings, on a ridge near the coast, two armies collided in a battle that would decide the fate of an entire civilization. Harold's shield wall held for hours against relentless Norman cavalry charges, and for a moment it seemed English resistance might prevail. But as the day wore on, an arrow, or perhaps Norman blades, in the chaos of a broken formation, found the English king, and with his death, the wall shattered. William the Conqueror had earned his name. He would go on to reshape England utterly, imposing Norman law, Norman language, and Norman nobility over a broken Saxon world, forever fusing two cultures into what would become the English identity we still recognize today. If you're finding this journey through the centuries as gripping as we do, take a moment to hit that subscribe button, because the story of the English crown is only just beginning, and it only gets more dramatic from here. The Normans brought castles of stone where there had once been wood, and with those castles came a new kind of tyranny, one enforced through fortification and fear. Yet even the mightiest conquerors cannot escape the curse of succession. William's sons quarreled bitterly over his inheritance, and England soon found itself locked in a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy, as two rival claimants, Stephen and the Empress Matilda, tore the country apart in a struggle so devastating that chroniclers said Christ and his saints slept through it. So absent did God's mercy seem. Out of this exhaustion rose a compromise, and with it, a new dynasty. The Plantagenets, beginning with Henry II, a king of ferocious energy and even more ferocious temper. Henry expanded English power across France and reformed the legal system in ways that would echo for centuries. But his reign was shadowed by tragedy of his own making, when his former friend and Archbishop, Thomas Becket, defied him over the rights of the Church. Henry's rage, whether spoken as command or merely as frustration, sent 4 knights to Canterbury Cathedral, where they cut Becket down before the altar itself. The murder of a saint within his own church horrified all of Christendom, and Henry was forced to walk barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, whipped by monks in penance, a king humbled before God for the blood on his hands. His sons proved no less turbulent. Richard the Lionheart, celebrated for his crusading glory in the Holy Land, spent barely months of his reign actually in England, preferring the battlefield to the throne room. It was his brother John who would leave the deeper mark, a king so distrusted, so resented by his own barons, that in 1215 they cornered him at Runnymede and forced him to seal a document that would alter the course of history. The Magna Carta did not create democracy, not yet, but it planted a seed. The radical idea that even a king was bound by law, that his power was not absolute. It was a wound to royal authority that would never fully heal, and future generations would return to those clauses again and again whenever kings overreached. The centuries that followed brought new dynasties, new wars, and new betrayals. But none would tear the kingdom apart quite like the conflict that erupted in the 15th century, when two branches of the Plantagenet family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, descended into a savage struggle for the crown. It became known as the Wars of the Roses, a name that sounds almost gentle for a conflict soaked in as much blood as it was. Noble families switched allegiances like coats. Brothers turned against brothers, and kings were crowned and deposed with dizzying speed. The instability reached its horrifying peak when the young sons of Edward IV, boy princes barely into adolescence, vanished into the Tower of London under the guardianship of their uncle, Richard III, never to be seen again. Whether murdered on his orders remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. But Richard's own reign would end in blood as well. Cut down at the Battle of Bosworth Field, the last English king to die in combat. His crown reportedly found afterward hanging in a thorn bush and placed upon the head of the victor, Henry Tudor. If this tale of ambition and betrayal has you hooked, drop a comment below telling us which monarch story you find most fascinating so far. We read every single one, and it helps us know what history to dive into next. Henry Tudor's victory brought a new dynasty, and for a time, a fragile peace, cemented through his marriage to Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses at last. But it was his son who would leave the deepest scar on English history. Henry VIII inherited a stable kingdom and a young man's confidence. But as the years passed without a male heir from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, his desperation curdled into obsession. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage, Henry did something almost unthinkable. He broke England away from the authority of Rome entirely, declaring himself the supreme head of a new Church of England. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were stripped of their wealth and torn down, their treasures seized by the crown. Henry would marry 6 times in total, and the fates of his wives became a grim rhyme remembered by schoolchildren for generations. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he had upended a nation's faith, would herself kneel at the executioner's block within just 3 years of becoming queen, accused of treason and adultery. In charges many historians believe were fabricated to clear the way for Henry's next wife. Out of this chaos of faith and blood would rise one of England's most legendary monarchs. Elizabeth I, daughter of the doomed Anne Boleyn, ascended to a throne surrounded by enemies who doubted a woman could rule at all, let alone hold together a kingdom torn by religious division. Yet Elizabeth proved herself a masterful survivor and a shrewd strategist, famously declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king even though she wore the body of a weak and feeble woman. She never married, using her marriageability as a diplomatic weapon rather than surrendering it to any single throne. And under her reign, England's navy shattered the supposedly invincible Spanish Armada, a victory that announced England's arrival as a rising power on the world stage. Her 45-year reign became remembered as a golden age of exploration, literature, and national pride, immortalized by playwrights like Shakespeare who flourished under her patronage. But Elizabeth died without an heir, and the crown passed to a Scottish king, James, uniting the thrones of England and Scotland for the first time under a single monarch. The Stuart dynasty that followed would prove even more turbulent than the Tudors before them. James's son, Charles I, inherited his father's belief in the divine right of kings, but lacked his father's political instincts entirely. He dissolved Parliament when it opposed him, ruled for over a decade without calling it back at all, and taxed his people without their consent, convinced that his authority came from God alone and answered to no earthly body. The tension between Crown and Parliament finally erupted into civil war, dividing families, towns, and the entire kingdom into royalists and parliamentarians who fought each other across muddy battlefields for years. When the war ended in Parliament's favor, Charles refused to accept any compromise that limited his power, and his own captors eventually concluded there was no path forward while he still breathed. Which brings us back to that frozen January morning we began with, the moment when England, in an act almost unthinkable to itself, took the life of its own anointed king. For 11 years afterward, England experimented with life without a crown at all, ruled instead by Oliver Cromwell as a military commonwealth. But the experiment could not last. The monarchy was restored in 1660, though never again would it hold quite the same absolute authority it once claimed. Decades of further turmoil followed, including the bloodless, glorious revolution that installed new monarchs under firmer parliamentary constraints, cementing forever the idea that England, soon to become Britain, would be ruled by king and parliament together, neither fully supreme over the other. We're not even finished with the story yet, and if you've made it this far, give this video a like. It genuinely helps this channel grow so we can keep bringing these forgotten stories back to life. The 18th century brought a new royal house entirely, the Hanoverians, imported from Germany when the Stuart line finally ran dry of Protestant heirs. George I could barely speak English, and the growing distance between crown and daily governance allowed a new position to emerge and take root. The Prime Minister, gradually assuming the practical business of running the nation. It was under this same Hanoverian line that Britain would suffer one of its most humiliating losses. When George III's stubborn refusal to compromise with distant colonists across the Atlantic pushed those very colonies into declaring their independence entirely, severing a piece of the empire that could never be reclaimed. Yet even as Britain lost an empire in the West, it was busy building one in the East, in India, in the Caribbean, and across the oceans of the world, becoming the largest empire the world had ever witnessed. That expansion reached its absolute zenith under a queen who would give her very name to an entire age. Victoria ascended the throne as a teenager in 1837, inheriting a monarchy still recovering from scandal and irrelevance, and transformed it into a symbol of stability, family values, and imperial grandeur that stretched across every continent on Earth. Her reign witnessed the Industrial Revolution reshape Britain into the workshop of the world. Railways stitching together a nation and an empire so vast it was said the sun never set upon it. Yet Victoria's public triumph concealed private devastation. When her beloved husband Albert died suddenly in 1861, she retreated into decades of mourning, dressing in black for the remainder of her long life. A queen who ruled an empire of unprecedented power while nursing a grief that never truly left her. By the time she died in 1901, the world she left behind was almost unrecognizable from the one she had inherited. A Britain transformed from a modest island kingdom into the beating heart of a global empire. From the muddy battlefields of Hastings to the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, from executed kings to empresses of half the world. The story of the British crown is a story of survival against impossible odds, of ambition, faith, betrayal, love, and blood. each generation inheriting not just a throne, but the weight of everything that came before it. It is a story still being written today, carried forward by a family whose name has echoed through 1,000 years of triumph and tragedy alike. If this journey through the centuries moved you even half as much as it moved us to tell it, share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered, not forgotten in the pages of some dusty old book.